Rome, 1938. A team of laborers working under direct orders from Benito Mussolini's government is digging through more than 40 feet of packed soil beneath the floor of the Colosseum. For over 14 centuries, nobody alive has stood in this space. The last games ended sometime in the early 500s AD, and after that, the underground world beneath the arena was left to rot, flood, and slowly vanish beneath the earth. Twice before, in 1811 and again in 1874, engineers had tried to dig it out, and twice the project collapsed, quite literally, as groundwater flooded the trenches faster than men could clear them. Now, under a dictator obsessed with resurrecting the glory of ancient Rome as a backdrop for his own image, the workers finally break through. What they find is not a simple basement. It is a labyrinth. Corridors branch in every direction. Strange grooves are cut into the stone walls at odd angles. Circular holes, some rimmed in smooth bronze, are sunk into the floor for no obvious reason. Nobody working that day has any idea what any of it was for. The wooden machinery that once filled this space rotted away 1,000 years earlier, leaving only its ghost carved into the stone. It will take another 60 years, and one obsessive German archaeologist, before anyone understands what they actually uncovered that year and how close humanity came to losing the secret of how the Colosseum truly worked. Forever. To understand why that underground world mattered so much, you have to understand what the Colosseum itself was built to prove. Officially known as the Flavian Amphitheater, it was commissioned by Emperor Vespasian around 72 AD on the site of a private lake that had belonged to the hated Emperor Nero. Vespasian's message was blunt. Where one tyrant had built a pleasure palace for himself alone, the new dynasty would build something for the people of Rome, and it would be the largest, most advanced entertainment structure the world had ever seen. Vespasian died before it was finished, and his son Titus inaugurated it in 80 AD with 100 straight days of games, an opening spectacle so extravagant that ancient writers claimed thousands of animals were killed in the arena over those 100 days alone. His younger son Domitian later added the underground level that would become the building's most complicated and most mysterious feature. At full capacity, the Colosseum could hold somewhere between 50 and 80,000 people, an entire small city gathered under one roof to watch gladiators fight, wild animals hunted for sport, and, in its very earliest days before the underground was built, mock naval battles staged by flooding the arena floor itself. Every one of those spectacles was a message, aimed just as much at the crowd as at anyone watching from outside Rome's borders. Rome could command not just armies and provinces, but life, death, water, and wild beasts, all on command, all for entertainment. The building was propaganda poured in stone and concrete, and it was engineered to keep delivering that message for centuries. The propaganda needed serious engineering to back it up, and the Romans didn't rely on a single miracle material. They combined several, each one chosen for a specific job. The outer walls and load-bearing piers were built from travertine limestone, quarried at Tivoli roughly 20 miles away, and hauled to Rome on a purpose-built road, prized because it was strong yet workable enough to cut into massive precision blocks. Iron clamps, originally sheathed in lead to stop them corroding, locked those blocks together. Those centuries of looters later pried many of them out just to steal the metal, leaving the pockmarked holes you can still see scattered across the walls today. Beneath the surface, Roman engineers turned to concrete, a mixture of volcanic ash, lime, and water that could be poured into the foundations and interior walls, and that only grew stronger with age, in some cases even underwater. A property modern concrete still struggles to replicate. In the upper levels, where the full weight of solid stone wasn't needed, they switched to lighter brick-faced concrete to reduce the load pressing down on everything below. The result was a building that was rigid enough to hold thousands of tons of stone suspended in the air, yet flexible enough to absorb the shocks of settling ground and eventually repeated earthquakes. The genius wasn't only in the materials, it was in the geometry. The Colosseum's design relies on a repeating system of arches and vaults, a kind of ancient modular construction that let Roman crews build fast and build strong across an enormous footprint. Barrel vaults, essentially long curved stone tunnels, carried the weight of the corridors and distributed it outward into the surrounding walls instead of straight down onto a single point. Where two barrel vaults crossed at right angles, they formed groin vaults, a woven, net-like structure overhead that could support the enormous weight of the upper seating tiers while still leaving open space beneath for corridors and stairways. This system let the Romans stack the Colosseum 4 stories high, roughly the height of a modern 12-story building, something that would have been structurally impossible with flat stone ceilings. It also allowed them to sort the audience strictly by social class as they rose through the levels: senators and nobility close to the arena floor, ordinary citizens in the middle tiers, and the poor and enslaved crammed into standing room wooden bleachers at the very top, farthest from the action and closest to the sun. None of that seating logic would have mattered if 50,000 people couldn't get in and out quickly. And this is where the design turns almost eerily modern. The Colosseum's exterior held 80 numbered entrance arches, each one funneling ticket holders who carried numbered pottery or bone tokens called tesserae toward a specific staircase and section, an ancient version of the exact same numbered gate system modern stadiums still use today. Through a network of radiating corridors called vomitoria, a term that simply meant a passage built to disgorge crowds fast, the entire building could reportedly empty in a matter of minutes, even at full capacity. It's the same design principle engineers reach for in football stadiums 2,000 years later, because nobody has ever come up with a fundamentally better way to move that many bodies through that little space that quickly. Even the sun itself was engineered against. Stretched across the top of the seating bowl was the velarium, a massive retractable awning made of linen sailcloth, anchored to roughly 240 wooden masts, slotted into stone brackets around the building's upper rim. Estimates put its total weight at somewhere around 24 tons of fabric and rigging. Because the job required exactly the kind of rope and sail expertise you'd expect from professional seamen, Rome permanently stationed a special detachment of its naval fleet from Misenum, near modern Naples, in barracks beside the Colosseum for the sole purpose of running the awning. On a signal, as many as 1,000 sailors could haul on the ropes in coordinated motion, extending or retracting sections of fabric to chase the shifting angle of the sun throughout the day, all while leaving a central opening over the arena floor itself so the fighters below never lost their light. According to one story that survives from antiquity, the earlier Emperor Caligula once ordered the velarium kept closed on a scorching day purely to punish a crowd he was annoyed with, trapping them in the heat as a display of raw power. Whether or not that particular tale is exactly true, it captures something real about how the Romans thought about the building. Shade wasn't just comfort. It was another lever of control. A full day at the Colosseum followed a rhythm the Romans understood as well as we understand a modern sports broadcast schedule. Mornings were reserved for the venations, staged wild animal hunts, in which trained handlers and hunters faced off against imported lions, leopards, bears, and even more exotic creatures shipped in from across the empire, specifically to be killed in front of a paying crowd. Midday brought executions, criminals and prisoners dispatched in front of the audience during the lull between the morning hunts and the afternoon's main event. And in the afternoon came the gladiators themselves, professional fighters trained at dedicated schools like the nearby Ludus Magnus, each one specializing in a different fighting style and armed accordingly. A heavily armored secutor might face off against a lightly equipped retiarius armed with only a net and trident, the mismatch itself part of the entertainment, a calculated contrast of speed against strength. Contrary to popular imagination, gladiators were expensive investments, trained for years, and fights to the death were not the default outcome of every match. Many bouts ended with one fighter yielding, and the crowd, not the emperor alone, often had real influence over whether a defeated gladiator lived or died, roaring their judgment until the presiding official made the call. But the real theater, the part the crowd never saw, happened below their feet. The arena floor itself was wood, covered in sand to soak up blood and give the fighters footing, and Domitian's underground addition, known today as the hypogeum, turned that floor into the roof of a hidden machine shop. Down there, in cramped brick corridors running the length of the building, animal handlers kept lions, leopards, bears, and other predators, penned and ready in a maze of holding cells. Gladiators waited in the dark for their names to be called, some of them arriving through a dedicated tunnel that connected directly to the Ludus Magnus, the gladiator training school just outside the Colosseum's walls, so fighters could move from barracks to battlefield without ever being seen crossing the open street. And scattered throughout the underground network were dozens of vertical shafts, each one leading straight up to a trapdoor in the arena floor above. At a signal, a caged animal or costumed fighter could be hoisted up and released into daylight with no warning at all, as if it had simply materialized out of the sand. For the 50,000 people in the stands, it looked like magic. For the roughly 200 people working the machinery underground, it was one of the most dangerous, sweltering, physically brutal jobs in the ancient world. Here is the problem that faced every historian for more than 1,000 years. Almost none of that machinery survived. It was built almost entirely from wood and wood rots. By the time archaeologists finally cleared the hypogeum in the 20th century, all that remained were negative spaces, empty grooves cut into stone where wooden beams once sat, holes in the floor where posts once stood, faint diagonal scars where ramps once slid. Historians were essentially staring at a crime scene where the weapon itself had disintegrated centuries earlier. They knew something extraordinary had operated down there. Ancient writers even described it in passing. The historian Herodian marveled that 100 lions could seem to appear from beneath the earth in a single coordinated group, as though the ground itself had opened. But nobody, for the better part of 2,000 years, could explain the actual mechanics behind that illusion. What kind of machine could lift a full-grown lion in its cage, silently, on cue, fast enough to look supernatural to 50,000 witnesses? That question went unanswered until one man's obsession finally cracked it open. Starting in the 1990s, a German archaeologist named Heinz-Jürgen Beste, working with the German Archaeological Institute in Rome, began spending years, eventually more than a decade, simply staring at the walls of the hypogeum, cataloging every mark, groove, and hole he could find, no matter how small or insignificant it seemed. The breakthrough came when he noticed a distinctive semicircular slice chipped out of the stone near several of the vertical shafts. It took him nearly a year of studying that one pattern before it clicked into place. The groove was exactly the shape needed to clear space for the swinging arms of a large, cross-shaped winch called a capstan, a device that men would push around in a circle to wind rope onto a central drum and lift enormous weight through simple mechanical advantage. Once he saw that single pattern, everything else in the hypogeum started falling into place around it, almost like a puzzle box springing open. The holes in the floor, some still lined with smooth bronze collars, were sockets for the capstan's central rotating post. The square mortises cut into the walls had once held the horizontal beams that supported both the capstans themselves and the wooden flooring separating the hypogeum's two underground levels. The diagonal grooves were tracks for tilting ramps that could slide massive painted scenery straight up into the sunlit arena. To prove his theory wasn't just an educated guest dressed up as archaeology. Best built scale models using nothing more sophisticated than toothpicks, cardboard, and paste. The same materials a child might use for a school project, except with precise, carefully measured proportions, taken directly from the stone. The models worked exactly as predicted. The physics held up under testing. Best eventually concluded that, at the height of its operation, the hypogeum contained around 60 of these capstans, each one 2 stories tall, requiring 4 men per level just to turn it, with roughly 40 of them dedicated to raising animal cages, and the remaining 20 built specifically to lift heavier scenery and set pieces. Later research suggests the system actually started much smaller, with as few as 28 lifts when the hypogeum was first constructed under Domitian, before being expanded to around 60 as the games grew more ambitious and more elaborate over the following century. Each lift could raise a caged animal weighing up to around 600 pounds, roughly the weight of 2 full-grown lions straight from total darkness into blinding daylight in a matter of seconds. Beste also found evidence for exactly how the whole chaotic system stayed coordinated. Roman numerals were carved into some of the capstans, suggesting a crew of stage managers standing in the corridors, calling out cues numbered lift by numbered lift, timing exactly when each individual trapdoor should burst open above them. Picture the scale of that operation for a moment. 200 or more workers, most of them enslaved, laboring in total darkness and summer heat that turned the corridors into something close to a boiler room, surrounded by the smell of animal waste, sweat, and torch smoke, listening for shouted commands over the roar of a crowd just above their heads, timing every pull of every rope to the second, because a trapdoor opening a beat too early or too late could ruin the entire spectacle, or get somebody mauled to death on live display. It was, in the most literal sense, a special effects department, built 2,000 years before anyone had invented the term special effects. The hypogeum wasn't finished the moment it was built either, and this is where the story gets even stranger. Beste's research identified at least 4 major building phases and dozens of smaller modifications spread across roughly 400 years of continuous use. Some of those changes were deliberate upgrades, new methods of staging games as tastes and stagecraft evolved. Others were forced by outright disaster. In 217 AD, lightning struck the Colosseum and started a fire that gutted much of the upper structure, sending huge blocks of travertine crashing down into the underground network below, crushing machinery and forcing years of expensive rebuilding under the emperor who followed. And fire wasn't the only disaster the building had to survive. Rome sits in a seismically active region, and earthquakes struck the Colosseum repeatedly across the centuries, in 847, in 1231, and again with devastating force in 1349, an event so violent that the entire outer ring on the building's south side collapsed outright and was never rebuilt. For hundreds of years afterward, that collapsed stone wasn't cleared away and preserved for future study. It was actively looted. Popes and noble Roman families quarried the fallen travertine to build their own palaces, and some of that same stone reportedly ended up in the construction of St. Peter's Basilica, treating one of the greatest engineering achievements in human history as nothing more than a convenient quarry. Long before any archaeologist arrived to study any of this, the Colosseum itself had already lived several completely different lives. The last recorded gladiatorial games took place around 435 AD, and the last animal hunts trailed off by the early 500s. After which the building simply stopped being an entertainment venue and started being whatever medieval Rome needed it to be next. For a while it served as housing, with small workshops and living quarters built directly into its arches. Later, the powerful Frangipani family fortified it and turned the entire structure into a private castle, using its thick walls and commanding height as a defensible stronghold during the chaos of medieval Roman power struggles. At various points, a small church was installed inside it, and part of the arena floor and hypogeum were quietly repurposed as a cemetery, so quietly that when archaeologists finally excavated the underground level in the 20th century, they uncovered numerous stone sarcophagi mixed in among the ancient machinery, silent proof that people had been burying their dead in the same corridors where lions once roared, without necessarily even knowing what those corridors had originally been built for. By the time the Renaissance arrived, most Romans no longer thought of the building as an amphitheater at all. It was simply a quarry, a convenient source of pre-cut travertine blocks sitting in the middle of the city, free for the taking. By the time later archaeologists tried to reclaim what was left, most of the underground level was buried entirely, and getting back down there turned out to be its own engineering nightmare. The 1811 and 1874 excavation attempts both failed. For the exact same reason, groundwater kept flooding the trenches faster than crews could physically dig them out, the very same hydraulic problem the Romans themselves had to solve 2,000 years earlier just to keep the hypogeum dry enough to operate during a live show. It wasn't until the 1930s excavation under Mussolini's government, the same dig that opened the story, that workers finally cleared the underground level completely, exposing it for detailed study for the first time in well over a millennium. But total darkness had preserved information that constant human traffic would have destroyed. And it took Beste's generation, working with modern tools and modern patience, to finally read what that darkness had protected. And even that wasn't the last secret the Colosseum was hiding underground. In 1810, decades before the full hypogeum excavation even began, workers had already stumbled onto something else entirely, a separate S-shaped corridor cut directly through the building's own foundation, structurally unrelated to the main hypogeum network. It was partially excavated in 1874, and then largely forgotten again for over a century, until archaeologists re-examined it in the 1990s. Even then, it wasn't properly restored until 2020 and 2021, and it did not fully open to the public until October 2025. What they found inside was extraordinary. The tunnel appears to have been carved roughly a century after the Colosseum's original completion, built for one purpose only, so that the emperor could travel from a private, secure entrance directly to the imperial box without ever setting foot among the general public he ruled. Carvings on its walls, once cleaned of nearly 2,000 years of accumulated grime, revealed images of animals and acrobats, a hidden decorative program meant for an audience of exactly one person. It is now known as the Passage of Commodus, and archaeologists who worked on it describe walking through it as the closest thing that exists to literally following in an emperor's footsteps, a secret route built entirely around the idea that Rome's most powerful man should never have to touch, or even see, the crowd that worshipped him. Put all of it together, the buried machinery beneath the sand, the numbered capstans lifting lions on cue, the sailors chasing the sun across the sky, the collapsed south wall quarried for palaces, the emperor's private tunnel hidden inside the foundation itself, and a very different picture of the Colosseum starts to emerge, one far stranger than the simple ruin most people picture. This wasn't just an arena, it was simultaneously a theater, a fortress, a hydraulic engineering project, and a piece of political theater built to run like clockwork in front of tens of thousands of witnesses at once. Every single day it was in operation. Every element of it, from the 4-story vaulting to the 80 numbered gates to the 60 hidden elevators grinding away in the dark, existed to serve one single goal, convincing every person in those stands that Rome, and the men who ruled it, controlled everything, down to the exact second a lion appeared to spring out of solid ground in front of them. What makes this story worth telling isn't just the raw scale of the engineering, though that alone would be remarkable for a structure built without a single power tool, poured concrete truck, or steel beam. It's how close all of it came to being permanently lost to history. If groundwater had kept the hypogeum buried for another century, if Beste had never noticed one semicircular groove in one wall and spent a full year staring at it until it finally made sense, the mechanical heart of the Colosseum might still be an unsolved mystery today, reduced to a handful of secondhand lines in ancient texts that historians could neither confirm nor fully picture in their minds. Instead, thanks to a dictator's excavation crews digging in 1938 and one archaeologist's 14 years of obsessive stonework analysis decades later, modern visitors can now walk through those same corridors, stand exactly where the capstans once turned, and see a full-scale reconstructed lift, built in 2015 using only the tools and materials the Romans themselves would have had access to, hoisted into position exactly the way it operated 2,000 years earlier. The Colosseum still isn't finished giving up its secrets either. Restoration work has continued for well over a decade now, part of a project launched in 2011 that is still ongoing, and new sections of the underground network and the imperial tunnel are still being cleared, cleaned, and opened to the public piece by piece, decades after Beste first started counting grooves in the dark by lamplight. Every new season of work seems to reveal another fragment, another scrap of graffiti scratched into a wall by a gladiator waiting for his name to be called, another socket for a machine nobody had properly cataloged yet, another passage that connects to somewhere unexpected. 2,000 years after it was first built to prove that Rome could control life, death, and everything in between, the Colosseum is still teaching archaeologists new things about exactly how far the Romans were willing to go to make that point. One buried groove, one flooded trench, and one obsessive researcher at a time. Think about what had to happen for any of this to reach us at all. A building had to survive fire, repeated earthquakes, centuries of looting, and burial under its own collapsed rubble, and still leave behind enough physical evidence, scars and stone rather than words on a page, for someone willing to spend 14 years staring at grooves in the dark to reconstruct a working machine from negative space. Most of what the Romans built in wood is simply gone, full stop, with no trace at all. The only reason the Colosseum's hidden machinery left a record is that stone, unlike timber, remembers the shape of what once pressed against it. Every future discovery down there depends on that same principle, on someone noticing a mark that everyone before them walked straight past. The 2025 opening of the Emperor's private tunnel proves the site still has more of those marks waiting to be read, tucked inside a building most people assume has already told us everything it has to tell. So the next time you see a photograph of the Colosseum's broken outer wall, standing half intact against the Roman skyline, remember that the missing half of that story isn't really missing. It's underground, carved into stone as grooves and sockets and bronze collars waiting for someone patient enough to notice it. That is, in the end, the real machine beneath the Colosseum. Not the capstans and the ropes alone, but the process of decoding them, one archaeologist, one flooded trench, and one overlooked groove at a time.